They say a family can survive almost anything, except the truth. That's how Christmas tasted that year. Brittle, sweet on the tongue, but full of splinters, the kind you only feel once you swallow. I remember the smell of roasting meat and cinnamon drifting under the archway, laughter bouncing against old wallpaper, but none of it could drown the thud of my heart as I watched my sister-in-law raise her wine glass, a gold necklace glittering at her throat. My necklace. The one I'd marked in secret, running a trembling fingertip along its clasp in the silence of my bedroom as invisible ink dried to nothing. It happened in a heartbeat, a flash of metal, the tilt of her chin, one careless smile slicing through my certainty. In that moment, the world rearranged itself. The bones of our house creaked with secrets, and I saw myself, very small, hiding in the paneled hallway, watching grown-ups move through light and shadow, always careful, always afraid of being noticed. But Christmas asks us to pretend, doesn't it? Pretend we're safe, happy, loyal, pretend we belong. At the table, the candles flickered against crystal, painting my mother's face with hope or fear, I could never tell. My brother's laughter echoed from the next room, my father's voice low and steady. Amid all this, my perfect sister-in-law, wealthy, beautiful, every strand of her hair artfully tamed, every gesture measured. She seemed unaware, or perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing. Either way, the room grew very still as I forced myself to breathe, my hands tight in my lap to keep them from shaking. Even now, I can hear the scrape of forks against china, the low hum as wine poured into glasses, the way everyone leaned in when she spoke. What did I really know about her? She married my brother 3 years ago. Her family old money, her smile quick, but not warm. I never trusted people who avoided looking you in the eye for longer than a few seconds. That's how I learned to read people. The pauses, the absences, the things left unsaid. It wasn't always this way. Once, I adored Christmas, the sense of certainty, of traditions. But dinner that year was crowded with ghosts, missing jewelry, whispered conversations, what felt like losses that only I noticed. Family heirlooms had begun to vanish, one at a time. Grandmother's brooch, gone from the velvet box. My mother's silver ring, missing from her nightstand. Each piece meant something, a history written in gold and stone, not only to me. It was enough to make me feel crazy, picking through drawers, asking myself if I was simply forgetful or if there was a thief among us. The necklace she wore wasn't just any necklace, it belonged to my late aunt, who'd whispered in my ear as a child, "Protect what matters. Some things are ours alone." I never told anyone why that necklace mattered, the way it glowed faintly in lamplight, the way its clasp clicked with a sound half memory, half wishful thinking that I'd marked it the week before, a single, invisible line along the inside hook, a trick I'd read about in a half-remembered detective novel. Trust is a test, my aunt used to say, and sometimes you have to help the truth reveal itself. I felt foolish, secretive, terrified someone would notice the faint chemical smell and ask questions no one did. Everyone was too busy, caught up in their own dramas, my mother fussing with dishes, my brother hurrying through funny stories from work, my father listening, grave as ever. That was the thing, each of us pretending, caught in the web of family myth, each avoiding the possibility that love can be both a blessing and a trap. So there she was, smiling, tossing her hair, the marked necklace catching light. I stared so hard I thought I'd burn a hole through her dress. Would she notice? Would anyone else? Was this the moment everything unraveled? My mother's voice carried over the table. "Darling, can you pass the potatoes?" Soft, practiced, missing none of the tension threading. My shoulders. My hand trembled as I reached for the bowl. Maybe I should have spoken up then, but old habits die hard. You learn to watch, to wait, to survive the storms quietly and alone, but the urge to speak no, to shout, swelled inside me with every passing minute. I watched my sister-in-law's fingers trace the necklace, watched her laugh at something my brother said, watched the way no one seemed to notice how new, how unfamiliar that jewelry looked on her time stretched. The clock ticked slow on the mantelpiece, every second louder than the last. In my mind, I rehearsed the words I'd use: accusation, evidence, consequence. Had she stolen from us, or was there something deeper, something darker, buried beneath a simple act of theft? Why this necklace, the one I'd marked, the one no one was supposed to touch? Memories, sharp and sudden, flooded me. Childhood birthdays, the heavy velvet box in my mother's closet, the way we used to gather for stories and secrets before anyone knew what secrets could cost. I remembered my mother's smile before it grew thin around the edges, remembered how every room in our home once felt safe, but nothing lasts forever. That's what I learned as the first course ended and the laughter began to fade. I looked around the table, tried to guess who else noticed the missing jewelry, who else felt the strange grip of expectation, dread, disappointment. My gaze caught my father's eyes, steady and searching. Had he seen? Did he suspect? I pressed my napkin to my lips, fighting for composure. The necklace glittered, daring me. My sister-in-law's voice rang out, sweet and sharp. I hope everyone likes the wine. The vintner is from Sonoma. It's terribly exclusive. The room nodded, murmured approval. I excused myself, slipped up the stairs, heart pounding, wanting to scream into the emptiness of my old bedroom. Christmas should be sacred, a time for forgiveness, for remembering why families matter. Instead, it opened old wounds, split me in two, part daughter, part judge, part unwilling witness. It was quiet in the hallway, quiet enough to think, quiet enough to remember where this all began. I saw the ink bottle beside my jewelry box, the magnifying glass I'd borrowed from my father's study. I thought about everything I'd lost, everything I'd tried to protect, how it all felt so fragile now. Years of silence, years of being the good child, the peacemaker, the one who noticed what others ignored. It comes at a cost, the loneliness of truth, the ache of wanting answers when none were offered. I heard laughter downstairs, a fragment of carol, then the sharp ring of my mother's voice. I wanted to rush down, declare what I'd found, demand justice. But fear held me. Fear of upsetting the peace, fear of being accused of jealousy, paranoia, or worse. In our family, appearances mattered more than honesty. Slowly, I opened my jewelry box, staring at the empty velvet slot where the necklace should be. The mark was gone, wiped away by her careless fingers or deliberate intent. How many times had I told myself I was imagining things, that objects simply vanished, that families never hurt one another except by accident? I glanced in the mirror, saw myself, pale, determined, uncertain. What would Auntie Mae say? Sometimes love means risking everything to make things right. My heartbeat slowed. I let the silence wash over me. I returned downstairs, breath steady, mind made up. The necklace's glint haunted every moment, every smile exchanged. I waited for the right time, the right pause in conversation, the point where attention would shift. I was done waiting for permission to demand the truth. That Christmas, everything changed. The moment I noticed, the moment I decided to act, the moment I realized families can be broken by the smallest lies or the loudest truths. I need to tell you about before the necklace, before the accusations, before I learned that families are built on sand and best intentions. Before I became the kind of person who marks jewelry with invisible ink and watches others through a lens of suspicion, and my childhood home was a Victorian with creaky floorboards and tall windows that overlooked the street. In autumn, leaves would gather against the porch, and I'd watch them from my room, pressing my forehead to the cool glass. The house always smelled of my mother's perfume, something floral and slightly sharp, like lilies left too long in a vase. That scent meant safety once. Now it just meant memory. My mother was beautiful in the way that demanded attention. She'd stand in the kitchen on Sunday mornings, sunlight catching her dark hair, humming something tuneless as she arranged flowers. She had this habit of tilting her head when she listened, as if truly considering what you said, really seeing you. I realize now that was a kind of performance, careful, practiced, designed to make you feel seen without ever revealing anything true about her. My father was quieter. He worked in finance, a detail I understood meant he dealt in numbers, certainty, logic. He'd come home carrying the weight of the day in his shoulders, set his briefcase down with a heavy sigh, then change into what he called his home clothes, soft sweaters, reading glasses pushed up into his hair. He was the one who'd actually listen when I talked about school, books, my growing obsession with secrets and mysteries. "Your mind works like a detective's," he'd say, almost proudly. I think now he meant it as both compliment and warning. My brother Marcus was 5 years older and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. He had my father's steadiness and my mother's charm, a combination that made him seem destined for something grand. He'd sail through high school, through college, through early career moves with the ease of someone who'd never doubted he belonged anywhere. I envied and resented him equally. He never asked questions. He simply trusted, and trust seemed to work out perfectly for him. Then there was me, the youngest, the observer, the one who noticed things. My mother used to joke that I had a serious face for such a young girl, as if seriousness were a flaw to be corrected. I'd spend afternoons in the library, reading mysteries and biographies, learning how people lied, how truth could hide beneath layers of normalcy. I was lonely in a house full of people, the kind of loneliness that comes from seeing too much and being unable to speak about it. Christmas was the one time our house felt truly alive. My mother would begin preparations in November, pulling down boxes of ornaments stored in the attic. Each ornament had a story, or so she claimed. This one from our first Christmas together, she'd say, holding up a delicate glass bird. This one from when Marcus was born. The stories were tender, worn smooth by repetition. I believed them then. The decorating was ritualistic. My father would wrestle the tree into the stand while my mother directed traffic, my brother laughed, and I hung ornaments with reverent care, afraid I'd break something precious. We'd drink hot chocolate afterward, steam rising into our faces, and my father would read a Christmas carol aloud in a voice that made even the darkest parts feel safe. My mother would sit close to him, her hand on his knee, and I think that's when I was happiest, when the four of us seemed like a complete unit, when there were no questions to ask, when love felt like something solid and permanent. Grandmother visits were regular, predictable events. Every other Sunday, she'd arrive in her Lincoln Continental, moving through the house with the authority of someone who'd lived longer and therefore knew better. She was my father's mother, stern, precise, but never unkind. She kept her jewelry in a velvet box with velvet compartments, each piece catalogued in a leather journal. She kept in her nightstand. I've thought about that journal many times since. What did she know? What had she recorded? She'd sit in the living room, her small frame swallowed by the wingback chair, and tell stories about family history. Your great-grandmother wore this brooch to her wedding in 1952, she'd say, and I'd listen, absorbing the weight of lineage, the responsibility of carrying something forward. These weren't just objects, they were proof. Proof we belonged to something bigger, something with weight and meaning. My mother and grandmother had a careful relationship. There was affection, certainly, but also something held back, an unspoken tension that hummed beneath their conversations. Grandmother would ask pointed questions. How are you managing the household expenses? Have you thought about taking a part-time position? My mother would smile and deflect, change the subject smoothly, the way she changed everything that I began noticing things around age 12. Small inconsistencies. My mother's story about how she and my father met didn't quite match what grandmother had once said. The timeline was off by several months, and there was this strange emphasis on certainty that felt performative. We met in spring of 1987, she'd say, very specifically, as if someone might contradict her. Then there were the phone calls. My mother would disappear into the study, close the door, and I'd hear the murmur of her voice, urgent and low. When she emerged, her face was different, softer in some ways, tighter in others. Just organizing a charity committee, she'd say if anyone asked. But her hands would shake as she poured her coffee. I learned early not to ask questions directly. Our family operated on a system of polite avoidance. If something was wrong, we didn't speak of it. If someone was sad, we didn't acknowledge it. We simply moved through our days with grace and discretion, maintaining the image of perfection. My father seemed aware of these undercurrents. He'd watch my mother sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read, not quite suspicion, not quite sadness. It was something else, something I'd later learn to recognize as resignation. The look of someone who'd chosen safety over truth, or perhaps truth had chosen him, and he'd made his peace with it. I had friends, of course. Normal friendships that existed in the realm of schoolwork and birthday parties, nothing too deep. But there was always a part of me standing apart, observing. I'd watch my friends' families and notice the same careful construction, everyone playing a role, everyone pretending that nothing difficult existed behind closed doors. My aunt, my mother's sister, was the exception. She was bold, unmarried, unafraid to speak her mind. She'd visit rarely, and when she did, she seemed to bring a kind of electricity into the house, a permission to be honest. She'd ask me real questions. How are you actually feeling? What do you want? She saw me in a way the others didn't, Or couldn't. That's where the necklace came from, a gift from her on my 16th birthday. She pressed it into my hands and said, "This is for you alone. Not for anyone else to borrow, not for your mother to hold safe, not for family obligation. For you. Protect what's yours." She meant more than jewelry, I think now. She was trying to teach me something about boundaries, about the right to have something untouched by family demands. I wore it constantly after that, even though my mother would occasionally say, "You should be more careful with that. Precious things deserve to be preserved." But I felt that my aunt meant for it to be worn, lived in, owned. Life continued in its ordered way. High school, college applications, the careful building of a future. My father's career advanced. My mother seemed content, or gave the appearance of contentment. My brother got married to a woman named Catherine, and suddenly we had someone new in our orbit, polished, ambitious, always perfectly presented. I was home from college that first Thanksgiving after their wedding. The house felt smaller somehow, or perhaps I simply saw it more clearly. Everything was the same furniture, the same light falling through the same windows, but something fundamental had shifted. Catherine moved through rooms with a kind of proprietorial ease, as if she were already imagining how she'd change things. That's when I first noticed something missing. My grandmother's ring. A simple platinum band with a diamond that caught light in particular ways. Grandmother had shown it to me years earlier, explaining its history, its significance. "This will be yours someday," she'd said, and I'd felt the weight of that promise. When I asked my mother where it was, she looked confused at first, then dismissive. "It's probably at the jeweler's for cleaning," she said, but there was something in her voice that didn't match the words. A fraction of a second where she seemed caught out. I never found out if it was at the jeweler's. I never pressed. That was my mistake. I think the first moment I chose silence over certainty, comfort over truth. But even then, seeds were planted. Even then, the slow unfurling of doubt had begun. The first real moment of doubt came on a Tuesday in March, unremarkable and ordinary in every way except that it wasn't. I was home for spring break, a junior in college, trying to study for an exam in my childhood bedroom. My mother had asked me to help organize the linen closet, a task that seemed designed to keep me occupied, to anchor me in the domestic sphere, as if college were making me too independent, too distant. I was pulling down old blankets when I found the box. It was tucked behind the sheets, a small jewelry box wrapped in tissue paper, the kind you'd get from an expensive store. My heart did something strange, a skip, then a heavy thud. I should have left it there. I should have closed the closet door and pretended I'd seen nothing. But curiosity has always been my weakness, the thing that drives me forward even when caution screams to stop. Inside, grandmother's ring. Not at the jeweler's. Not being cleaned. Just sitting there, in a box, hidden in the linen closet like contraband. I held it up to the light, felt its weight, tried to understand what this meant. Why would my mother hide it? And more importantly, when had she hidden it? I stood there in the half-light of the closet, the tissue paper crumpling in my fist, feeling something shift in my chest. A loosening, a crack in the foundation I'd built my sense of safety upon. I didn't confront her. I simply closed the box, replaced it exactly where I'd found it, and said nothing. This was a choice I made consciously, the choice to observe, to gather information, to become someone who kept secrets from her own family. That choice had consequences I didn't fully understand at the time. Over the following weeks, I found myself watching my mother more carefully. The way she moved through the house took on new meaning. When she straightened the paintings or adjusted the flowers in a vase, I wondered, were these genuine gestures of care, or performances? When she called my father darling with that particular tone, affectionate but distant, was it love or habit? She began taking more phone calls in the study, closing the door with increasing frequency. I'd hear her voice rise slightly, then catch herself, modulate back down to measured calm. Once, I stood in the hallway and heard her say, "I can't do this anymore. It's not sustainable." A pause. Then, because of the children. Because of him. The study door opened moments later, and she emerged with a smile fixed on her face like a mask, as if she hadn't just been having a conversation laden with desperation and guilt. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was reading too much into ordinary moments, that my detective novel obsession was making me paranoid. But doubt, once planted, grows like a weed. It spreads through every thought, every conversation, every innocent exchange, and my father seemed to sense something too. He'd become quieter, more withdrawn. He'd spend evenings in his study with the door closed, ostensibly reading or working. But I'd pass the door and hear nothing, just silence, heavy and deliberate. Once, I saw him sitting in the dark, no lamp on, just the faint glow of city lights through the window. He was staring at nothing, his face carved from stone. I wanted to ask him if he knew something. If he'd noticed what I'd noticed. But I didn't know how to bridge that gap, how to speak about things our family had trained us never to speak about. Then came the document. I was looking for my father's tax forms. He'd asked me to help him organize files for his accountant when I found a folder labeled Simply Personal. Inside were photographs I'd never seen before. Candid shots of my mother with a man who wasn't my father. Not at some event or family gathering, but intimate moments, her head on his shoulder at what looked like a cafe, the two of them standing close in what appeared to be a hotel corridor, her hand in his, her face incandescent with something that looked like joy but felt dangerous. The photographs were old, the colors faded, the edges soft. They dated from decades earlier, from before I was born. But that detail did nothing to ease the shock of seeing my mother unguarded, happy in a way I'd never witnessed in her actual life, with a man I didn't recognize. I stood there in the study, the photographs trembling in my hands, and felt the ground beneath me shift. This wasn't a missing ring or a hidden conversation. This was evidence of a life my mother had lived before the one I knew, a life that involved someone else, someone important enough that these photographs had been kept, hidden but preserved. I didn't look at all of them. I couldn't. Instead, I carefully placed them back in the folder, closed it, and left the study. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. I wanted to run upstairs and demand explanations, wanted to confront my mother with what I'd seen. But I didn't. Instead, I went to my room and began the work of creating a private archive. I took my phone. This was before smartphones were ubiquitous, so I used my parents' old digital camera they'd left in a drawer and photographed each image, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. The photographs of photographs, distant and imperfect, but enough. Evidence that I wasn't imagining things. Over the next few weeks, I watched my family with new eyes. Every interaction between my parents seemed coded now, laden with meaning I was only beginning to understand. My mother's careful politeness toward my father. His gentle distance. The way they occupied the same space without ever quite touching. I began going through other boxes, other closets, other hiding places. Not aggressively, not with confrontation in mind, but methodically, like someone gathering pieces of a puzzle that was meant to stay broken. I found receipts for hotel stays in cities I'd never heard them mention. I found a journal, not my mother's, but someone else's, tucked in the back of a dresser drawer. I didn't read it fully. The violation felt too extreme even for my newly suspicious self. But I saw enough. Dates, initials, phrases like "can't keep doing this and she deserves to know." The evidence was mounting, brick by brick, constructing a new architecture of understanding. My mother wasn't who I thought she was. Or rather, she was many people. The woman who sang to us at Christmas, the woman who kept hidden photographs, the woman who made hushed phone calls, the woman who sometimes looked at my father with something like pity. One evening, I overheard my parents talking in their bedroom. I was in the hallway, ostensibly heading to get water, but I paused when I heard my father's voice. Low and serious. "She's getting suspicious," my mother said. My heart stopped. Were they talking about me? "She's intelligent," my father replied. "She notices things. We always knew this would be difficult. I'm afraid of what happens when she knows the truth." There was a long silence. I held my breath, waiting for my father to respond, to reveal what truth they were discussing. But the silence stretched too long, and I heard my mother say something else, something I couldn't quite make out. The conversation shifted to other topics, practical matters, logistics, and I retreated to my room, my mind spinning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and felt the first real bloom of fear. Not suspicion anymore, not curiosity, but genuine fear. Fear that the world I'd grown up in was built on lies. Fear that the people I loved weren't who I thought they were. Fear of what would happen when the truth finally surfaced. The next morning at breakfast, everything looked the same. My mother served pancakes. My father read the newspaper. The sunlight fell through the kitchen window in familiar patterns. But I could no longer pretend I didn't see the cracks in the facade. I decided that day that I needed to know the full truth. Not suspicions or half-glimpses through closed doors, but the entire story. I began paying closer attention to details, began leaving my own small tests. A pen moved slightly in a drawer to see if anyone touched it. Questions asked in casual ways that weren't really casual at all. My family was keeping a secret. A big one. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. The doubt that had started small, a hidden ring, a strange phone call, had grown into something consuming. I couldn't unknow what I'd seen. I couldn't go back to being the daughter who trusted blindly, who accepted the stories at face value. The worst part wasn't the not knowing. It was the knowing that there was something to know. It was the awareness that my family, the foundation of my entire life, was built on careful deception. And I was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. The email was open on my father's computer. He'd stepped away to take a phone call, and I'd moved into his study to ask a question, or so I'd tell myself later, constructing a narrative of accident rather than deliberate snooping. The screen glowed with a message thread, and I saw my mother's name in the recipient line. I shouldn't have read it. I knew, even as my eyes moved across the words, that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I couldn't stop. The curiosity that had been building for months crystallized into a need, an urgency that overrode my sense of propriety. The email was from my father to my mother, dated 3 days earlier. I've been thinking about what we discussed. About whether we should tell her. I think she deserves to know. The longer we wait, the worse it will be. She's already asking questions. I can see it in her face. I know you're afraid, but I think the fear is worse than the truth. Please. Can we talk about this? Properly? Without hedging or pretending? Below it, my mother's response, time-stamped the next morning. Not yet. Not until after the holidays. She's happy now. Let her have that. Once everything comes out, everything changes. Her entire sense of who she is changes. I'm not ready for that. And frankly, I don't think she is either. Give me until after Christmas. Then we tell her everything. I stood very still, my hands cold, my vision narrowing to just those words on the screen. Tell her everything. Tell me what? What was the secret so significant that it required strategic timing, that it had to be withheld through the holidays, that my father clearly believed I was ready to know while my mother insisted I wasn't? The fear I'd felt before transformed into something sharper, more acute. Not suspicion anymore, but certainty that something fundamental was about to shatter. I heard my father's footsteps approaching the study and quickly moved away from the desk, my heart hammering so violently I thought he must hear it. He came in, glanced at his computer, then looked at me. For a moment, I thought he knew. I thought I saw suspicion flash across his face. But then he simply asked if I needed something, and I mumbled about a book I was looking for that night. I couldn't eat dinner. My mother kept asking if I was feeling well, her concern so carefully calibrated it felt like performance. My father watched me with an expression I couldn't decipher. My brother talked about work, oblivious to the tension that seemed to saturate the air. Only I could perceive. I needed answers. Real ones. Not fragments and implications, but the full truth, laid bare. The next morning, I woke with purpose. I began my investigation in earnest, no longer trying to make it look accidental or casual. I went through my parents' bedroom methodically. I opened drawers, examined documents, photographed anything that seemed relevant. In a locked box at the back of my mother's closet, I found letters, handwritten letters in a masculine script, addressed to my mother, full of endearments and longing. I miss you constantly, one read. I miss the life we almost had. But I understand why it has to be this way. For her sake, and for yours. Still, I think about what might have been. The letters were dated from over 20 years ago. They were signed with initials. RMI felt sick. The room tilted slightly, and I had to sit down on the edge of my parents' bed, holding the letters in trembling hands. My father's initials were DH. Who was RM? Who was the man in the photographs? Who was my mother's great love, the one she'd chosen to leave, the one she'd apparently corresponded with in secret? I photographed the letters with the same methodical detachment that had carried me through the weeks of investigation. I was operating on a level beyond emotion now, functioning in a state of pure information gathering. My feelings could come later. Right now, I needed facts. Then I found the birth certificate. It was in a manila folder tucked behind old tax returns, the kind of place you'd store documents you didn't want to think about regularly. The certificate bore my name, dated with my birthday, but listed under father was not David Harris. The name was Robert Michael Castelliano. The room contracted. My vision tunneled. I couldn't breathe for a moment, literally couldn't draw air into my lungs. I read the name again, certain I'd misunderstood, but the letters remained the same, Robert Michael Castelliano. R.M. The man in the photographs. The man my mother had loved enough to hide her affair in her heart for over 2 decades, and my father, the man I'd called Dad my entire life, was not my biological father. I sat on the floor of my parents' bedroom, the birth certificate in my hands, and felt my entire identity splinter. Every memory seemed to shift in meaning. Every moment of being his daughter, his serious little detective, his investment in my future, was it built on a lie? Did he know? Had he always known? Of course he knew. The emails made sense now. Tell her the truth. Her entire sense of who she is changes. They weren't discussing whether to tell me about an affair. They were discussing whether to tell me that the man I'd loved and trusted my entire life wasn't actually my father, that my entire genetic inheritance came from someone else, someone I'd never met. I photographed the birth certificate with shaking hands, then carefully replaced it exactly where I'd found it. I was functioning on pure adrenaline now, moving through the house like a ghost, trying not to scream. That afternoon, I drove to the library and began my real research. I found Robert Michael Castelliano listed as a professor of art history at a university 3 hours away. There were photos of him on the faculty page, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a blazer, smiling for the camera. My eyes. I had his eyes. I sat in the library, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile this image with the reality of my life. This man was my father. This man lived in a different city, taught students, presumably had a life completely separate from mine. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. And yet, we were bound by biology, by the accident of my mother's choices, by a secret that had shaped my entire existence without my knowledge. I wrote down his phone number from the faculty page. I didn't call it. Not yet. But I carried that number with me like a talisman, like proof that I wasn't insane, that the world I'd constructed was real, that there was someone out there who could confirm what I'd discovered that evening. I watched my family with new understanding. My father, David, moved through the house with the weight of a man carrying an enormous secret. My mother was bright, almost manic, overcompensating with cheerfulness. She kept putting her hand on David's arm, as if reassuring herself that he was still there, still hers despite everything. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand to know how they could have lived with this deception, how they could have let me grow up not knowing the fundamental truth about myself. But I also recognized the fragility of the moment, the way my parents seemed balanced on a knife's edge. So I remained silent. I played the role of dutiful daughter. I helped with dinner, laughed at appropriate moments, went through the motions of normalcy while inside, I was coming apart. That night, alone in my room, I allowed myself to cry. Not quietly, not the controlled, private tears I normally permitted myself. I cried with my whole body, angry and betrayed and confused. I cried for the person I thought I was, the person I'd need to become. The person my mother had made me without ever asking my consent. And as I lay in bed, exhausted from crying, I made a decision. I would not confront them yet. I would gather more information. I would understand the full scope of their deception before I demanded answers. Because I'd learned something in these weeks of investigation, the truth is more complicated than lies. People don't deceive out of malice, they deceive out of fear, love, desperation, and the human need to believe that some things can be controlled, managed, hidden away where they won't hurt anyone. But secrets don't stay buried. They permeate everything, poisoning relationships from the inside out. And eventually, they surfaced. I was going to make sure that when this secret surfaced, I understood every dimension of it. I was going to make sure that when I confronted my parents, I did so not in anger, but in knowledge. The betrayal was complete, total, and utterly transformative. I was no longer the person I'd been that morning. I was someone new, someone harder, someone who understood that the world was not as it appeared, that the people you loved most could keep secrets of staggering proportions from you, that I was ready to find the truth. I just didn't know yet how much it would cost. The next week was the longest of my life. I moved through my days in a state of controlled dissociation, saying the right things, appearing normal on the surface while underneath, I was reconstructing my entire understanding of reality. My mother kept remarking that I seemed distracted, and I'd deflect with stories about exams, about college stress, about the usual pressures of being 20 years old. She wanted to believe these explanations. I could see the relief in her face when I offered them, the gratitude that I wasn't forcing her to have the conversation she clearly wasn't ready for. My father watched me more carefully. Once or twice, I caught him looking at me with an expression that seemed to contain apology. Or perhaps resignation. I wondered if he saw the knowledge in my face, if he could sense that I'd discovered the secret they'd been planning to tell me after Christmas. I wondered if he was relieved that I now knew, or if he was terrified of what I might do with this information. I researched Robert Michael Castelliano obsessively. I found his faculty bio, which revealed he'd been at the university for 18 years. I found his dissertation, a work on Renaissance portraiture and the concept of authentic self-representation in art. The irony wasn't lost on me. My biological father had spent his career studying how we present false selves to the world, how art itself is often a lie designed to conceal truth. I found articles he'd written for academic journals. I found a book he'd published 15 years ago. I read his words, searching for traces of myself in them, looking for some genetic marker of similarity in the way he constructed arguments, the metaphors he used. It felt invasive and necessary, archaeological work on a stranger who was supposed to be family. I also found his phone number again, and this time, I memorized it. There was a Facebook profile, not particularly active, but enough to show his life. His posts were rare but thoughtful, quotes about art, photos of gallery exhibitions, the occasional personal observation about teaching. His profile picture showed him in front of what looked like a museum, smiling at the camera with an openness that made my chest hurt. He looked kind. He looked like someone I might have liked, under different circumstances. I tried to imagine what to say to him. How do you call a stranger and explain that you're his daughter, that your mother had an affair with him over 20 years ago, that you've only just learned your entire identity is built on a foundation of secrecy? There was no script for this. No way to make the words sound anything other than shocking, but I needed to hear his voice. I needed to know if he'd always known about me, or if this would be a surprise to him as well. I needed to understand what role he'd played in the decision to keep me hidden from him. It was a Thursday evening when I finally called. I was in my dorm room, door locked, with my roommate safely at the library. My hands shook as I dialed, and I nearly hung up 3 times before the call connected. Hello. A man's voice, older, measured, curious about the unknown number. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. All the words I'd rehearsed vanished. I stood there, breathing into the phone, feeling like an intruder in his life. Hello, he said again, slightly concerned now. Is anyone there? My voice came out as a whisper. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry. I'm looking for Robert Castelliano. This is he. Can I help you? I closed my eyes. His voice was warm, patient. Not the voice of someone who would abandon a child, though I knew nothing about his involvement in my abandonment. Perhaps he didn't even know I existed. My name is, I stopped myself. I couldn't give my full name. Not yet. Not until I understood the situation more completely. My name is Sarah. And I think we might be related. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. So long that I thought he might have hung up. Then, Sarah. Can you tell me your last name? Harris. Sarah Harris. I was giving him my legal surname, the name of the man who'd raised me, not the name that appeared on my birth certificate. Another silence, deeper this time, and I heard him exhale slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath. I think, he said carefully, that you might want to call me back at a time when you can talk more freely. This conversation feels like it deserves privacy and time. You know, I said. It wasn't a question. You know about me. I know that there's a possibility, he said slowly. A possibility that's been complicated. But yes, I think I might know who you are. Can you call me tomorrow? During the day? I want to talk to you properly, not like this. We exchanged information. He gave me his personal cell number, and I promised to call the next day. When I hung up, I sat on my dorm bed and felt something in me crack open, not painfully, but like a necessary breaking, the kind that has to happen before healing can begin. The next morning, I skipped my classes. I sat in the library, waited until noon, then found a quiet corner and called him back. Sarah, he said, and the warmth in his voice made me want to cry. Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. I found my birth certificate, I said without preamble. I found letters. I found photographs. I know that my mother, that you and my mother. Slow down, he said gently. Take a breath. Yes. Your mother and I had a relationship a long time ago. A serious one. But it was complicated by circumstances that were beyond our control. I think we should talk about this properly. Face to face, if you're willing. My parents don't know that I know, I said. My father, David, is planning to tell me after Christmas. My mother wants to wait. Of course they do, Robert said, and I heard something like sadness in his voice. This has always been about protecting you. Both of them, in their own ways, have been trying to shield you from the truth because they love you. That doesn't make the secrecy right, but it's important you understand their motivations. Will you meet with me? I asked. Before they tell me, I need to hear from you first. I need to understand what happened. There was another pause, and I could almost hear him thinking, weighing the implications of what I was asking. Yes, he said finally. I'll meet with you. When can you come? We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a cafe near his university. I chose the location he suggested because it was public, neutral ground, the kind of place where a stranger could briefly become someone I knew without the encounter feeling too intimate or too dangerous. I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I'd made contact with my biological father. In a week, I would meet him. The secret was no longer entirely secret, he knew I knew. And I was committed to understanding the full story before my parents forced it upon me in their carefully controlled way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and thought about Robert, about the story I'd discovered, about the choices people make when they're faced with impossible circumstances. I thought about my mother, young and in love with someone she couldn't have. I thought about David, choosing to raise a child that wasn't his, choosing love and commitment over genetic claim. I thought about myself, caught in the middle of all these choices, inheriting the consequences of decisions made before I was even born. The week passed in a strange fog. I attended classes but retained nothing. I made conversation with friends but couldn't focus on what they were saying. I was existing in two realities simultaneously, the life I'd always known and the new life that was about to begin. My parents didn't notice anything unusual. Or if they did, they chose not to acknowledge it. We were all becoming experts at pretending, at maintaining the surface while the foundation crumbled beneath us. Friday arrived. I packed a bag as if I were going somewhere routine, told my roommate I was visiting a friend for the weekend, and drove 3 hours to a city where my biological father was waiting. I drove carefully, checking my mirrors, aware of every moment of the journey as if it were significant, and it was. Every mile took me further from my old life and closer to the truth I'd been searching for. When I arrived in the city, I parked my car in a lot 2 blocks from the cafe. I couldn't go directly. I needed time to prepare myself, to breathe, to become whoever I needed to be to have this conversation. I sat in my car and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I saw my eyes, Robert's eyes, looking back at me. I saw the face of someone caught between 2 worlds, 2 identities, 2 families. Tomorrow, I would meet Robert. Tomorrow, I would begin to understand the truth. And everything would change. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. It was a small place, the kind that serves artisanal coffee and hosts quiet conversations. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes that seemed to float suspended in time. I ordered something I didn't want, a cappuccino, and chose a table in the corner where I could see the entrance clearly. My hands were shaking. I clasped them together, pressed them against my lap, tried every technique I'd learned over years of maintaining composure. Nothing worked. The knowledge of what was about to happen sat in my chest like a stone. T247, he arrived and I recognized him immediately from the faculty photo, but the image hadn't captured something essential about him, the way he moved, perhaps, or the particular expression of gentle thoughtfulness that seemed to be his natural state. He was taller than I'd expected, with silver threading through his dark hair, wearing a blazer that looked soft and well-worn. He looked like someone who'd learned to be comfortable in his own skin, and I envied him that ease. He scanned the cafe, and when his eyes found me, I saw the moment of recognition, not just identifying my face, but seeing something of himself reflected back. His expression shifted into something tender and uncertain, and he approached slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might startle me. "Sarah." His voice was careful, questioning, as if even now he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to claim kinship. I stood up, though I'm not sure why. Some instinct about respect, or perhaps just the need to be on equal footing. "Yes. You're Robert." "I am." He sat across from me, leaving space, not crowding my air. "I'm very glad you came." For a moment, we simply looked at each other. I was searching his face for familiarity, for genetic markers, for proof that we were connected by more than just the information I'd discovered. He seemed to be doing something similar, cataloging features, looking for inheritance written in bone structure and coloring. "I don't know where to start," I said finally. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I think I should explain. About your mother, about what happened between us. Because you deserve to understand that none of this, none of the secrecy, none of the decisions made about you, came from anything other than love. Complicated, messy, sometimes misguided love, but love nonetheless." He ordered coffee when the waitress approached, then leaned back, gathering his thoughts. "Your mother and I met at university," he began. "I was teaching, she was a graduate student in literature. We didn't plan for anything to happen between us. It was just there. This immediate recognition, this sense of finally meeting someone who understood you completely. I was already married at the time, unhappily married, but still married. Your mother wasn't in a relationship, but she knew about my situation from the beginning. We tried to be responsible. We tried to maintain boundaries. But love doesn't respect boundaries very well." He paused, looking into his coffee as if the dark liquid might contain the words he needed. "We had an affair for about 2 years, he continued. "It was the most important 2 years of my life and also the most shameful. Your mother and I talked about leaving our old lives, starting over together, but there were complications. Her family situation, my marriage, the professional implications of what we were doing. And then she became pregnant." My chest tightened. I'd known this intellectually, but hearing him say it aloud made it suddenly, viscerally real. "When she told me, I wanted to leave everything," Robert said. "I wanted to marry her. Wanted to be your father publicly, wanted to build a life with the two of you. But your mother was afraid. Afraid of the scandal, afraid of what it would mean for her family, afraid, and this was hardest for me to accept, afraid of what kind of life a child would have if she left everything behind to be with me." He looked up from his coffee, meeting my eyes directly. "She made a choice," he said. "Not to protect herself, but to protect you. She met someone else, a man named David Harris, someone kind and stable and willing to raise you as his own. She chose to give you a legitimate family, a father who would never question your worth or your place in his life. And she asked me to step back. To let her do this. Did you?" I asked. "Did you just let go?" "I tried," he said. "For your sake and for hers, I tried. But I couldn't completely disappear. I kept watching from a distance. I followed your life through her letters, through occasional updates. I've known about you your entire existence, Sarah. I've never been absent, I've just been invisible." Tears were running down my face now. I didn't remember starting to cry, but there they were, hot and steady, blurring my vision. "Why?" I asked. "Why keep writing to her? Why not just move on?" "Because I loved her," Robert said simply. And because knowing you existed gave me a way to stay connected to that love, even if I couldn't be part of your life. The letters were for her, but they were also for you, a record of my care, my presence, even from a distance. I wanted her to know that I didn't regret you. That you were the best thing that came from our relationship, even if I had to love you from afar. I thought about the letters I'd found, reread them now with new understanding. The longing wasn't just for my mother, it was also for me, for the life that couldn't be. Does David know? I asked. Does he know that you've always been in contact with my mother? He does now, Robert said. They discussed it a few years ago. After some of the letters were discovered. David was angry, understandably angry. But he also understood that cutting off contact entirely would have been cruel to your mother. They came to an agreement. The letters would stop, or at least become less frequent. Your mother honored that agreement. Why is she telling me now? I asked. Why after all these years? Because you're old enough to understand, Robert said. Because the secret was becoming a burden, and she loves you too much to keep lying to you indefinitely. Because David believes you deserve to know your own history, even if it's complicated. And perhaps, he paused, because she was afraid you'd discover it on your own, and she wanted to control the narrative. That stung a little, the accuracy of it. But I understood. I'd discovered the truth myself, after all, through my own investigation. My mother had been right to fear that. What does she want from me? I asked. Now that I know. I don't think she wants anything, Robert said carefully. I think she wants forgiveness. And she wants you to understand that the choice she made, the choice to keep me out of your life, was made with your best interests in mind, even if it was also made to protect herself. And what do you want? Robert was quiet for a long time. He looked at me with such intensity that I felt seen in a way I hadn't in months, not observed, but truly seen, recognized, known. I want to know you, he said finally. Not as a father, necessarily, that ship has sailed, and honestly, I don't think either of us is quite sure what that would look like at this point. But as someone connected to you. As someone who cares about your well-being and your happiness. Whether that's possible, I don't know. That's up to you. I thought about what he was offering, not a traditional relationship, but something else. Something honest and bounded by the reality of our circumstances rather than by biological claim. I need time, I said. I need to process this. I need to talk to my parents. I understand, Robert said. Take all the time you need. And Sarah, I'm sorry. For the affair, for the complications, for not being there. I'm sorry for all the ways this situation has been difficult for you. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We talked for another hour. He told me about his work, about why he'd chosen to study art history, something about the desire to understand how people express what can't be said directly. He asked me about my life, my studies, my dreams. He listened in a way that felt like genuine attention, not the careful listening my parents did, always filtered through their own needs and fears. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car. We stood there awkwardly, neither of us quite sure how to conclude this meeting. I meant what I said, he told me. About wanting to know you. But only if you want that too. I won't impose. Can I call you? I asked. Sometimes. His face brightened. I'd like that very much. I drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with everything I'd learned. Robert wasn't a villain, he was a complicated man who'd made difficult choices and had to live with the consequences. He wasn't a hero either, but something more real and human than either of those archetypes. What struck me most was the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at me. He didn't expect anything from me except my presence, my willingness to acknowledge that he existed. He carried no resentment toward David, no bitterness toward my mother. He simply existed in the aftermath of decisions made long before I was born, making peace with circumstances beyond his control. That night, I lay in bed and let everything settle inside me. I was no longer angry at Robert. My anger, the white-hot, clarifying anger I'd been carrying, was starting to shift toward my parents. Specifically, toward my mother. She'd made the choice to keep Robert from me. She'd decided what was best for me. Without trusting me with the truth. I understood why. But understanding and accepting are not the same thing, and I still had to face them. I still had to navigate the conversation they were planning to have with me after Christmas. I still had to decide whether to reveal that I'd already discovered the secret, or whether to let them believe they were telling me something new. That decision, I knew, would shape everything that came after. I returned home on Sunday evening, and everything felt smaller than I remembered. The house that had once seemed like a fortress of stability now looked fragile, held together by secrets and careful omission. My parents greeted me with the usual questions: how was my friend? Did I have a good weekend? Was I eating enough at school? I answered automatically, playing the role of dutiful daughter with a precision born from weeks of practice. What I didn't know was that my absence had been noticed by someone other than my family. My mother's closest friend, Patricia, lived 3 doors down. They'd been friends for decades, sharing coffee every Tuesday morning, confiding in each other with the kind of intimacy that comes from decades of proximity. On Monday, my mother called me at college with an edge to her voice I'd never heard before. "I need you to come home this weekend," she said without preamble. "Something has happened, and we need to discuss it as a family." My stomach dropped. What happened? Not over the phone. Please come home. I drove home on Friday, my mind racing with possibilities. Had they discovered that I knew? Had something happened with Robert? Had Patricia overheard something, pieced together the puzzle, decided to intervene? When I arrived, my mother was in the kitchen, and she looked exhausted in a way I'd never seen before. She'd aged years in a single week. My father was in his study, the door closed, and I could hear the low murmur of his voice on a phone call. "What's going on?" I asked. My mother sat down heavily at the kitchen table, gesturing for me to sit across from her. "Patricia came to see me yesterday," she said. She was upset. She said that she'd run into someone at the grocery store, Robert Castelliano. He mentioned that he'd recently met with you, that you'd reached out to him. The room went very still. "I can explain," I started, but my mother held up her hand. "Let me finish. Patricia told him that she knew your father and me, that she'd known us for years. And Robert, apparently feeling some obligation to honesty, told her the truth. About the affair, about you, about everything." I felt my face burn. I'd never considered that Robert might have his own connections to my mother's community, that my visit to him might ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. "Patricia came to me and told me what she'd learned," my mother continued. "And she was shocked. Betrayed, even, that I'd never confided in her. She said that our friendship was built on trust, and that I'd violated that by keeping such a significant secret." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "The truth," my mother said bitterly. "What else could I do at that point?" I told her about Robert, about the circumstances, about why we'd made the choices we made. And she listened, and when I was done, she told me that she needed time to process, that she didn't know if she could maintain our friendship given this revelation. I watched my mother's face crumple slightly, watched her try to hold herself together. 30 years, she said softly. "We've been friends for 30 years. And in a single conversation, she learned that I'd been lying to her the entire time. Not directly, perhaps, but through omission. Through the construction of a false narrative about who I am and where I come from." My father emerged from his study then, his expression grave. He'd clearly been listening to the conversation from his closed door. "It gets worse," he said, and gestured for me to sit down properly. "Patricia has already told at least 2 other people. Our neighbor, Michelle, and someone from the church committee. Information like this has a way of spreading, Sarah. By Monday, half the community is likely to know." I felt something clench in my chest. I'd set this in motion, not intentionally, but through my own search for truth, I'd inadvertently exposed my family's greatest secret to the world. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted answers." "We know," my father said. "And we're not angry with you. But we need to talk about what comes next. Because the secret is out now, and we have to decide how to manage that." Over the weekend, the consequences unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion. My mother received a call from the church asking her to step down from her position on the liturgy committee. A longtime friend stopped returning her calls. When she ran into Patricia at the grocery store on Saturday, Patricia was polite but distant, the warmth completely drained from their interaction. I saw my mother try to maintain her composure, saw her smile and pretend that everything was fine, but I could see the fractures forming. The image she'd carefully constructed, the devoted wife, the loyal friend, the woman of integrity, had shattered, and there was no way to glue it back together. My father, surprisingly, seemed less affected. Perhaps because his role in the deception was secondary, or perhaps because he'd already made peace with the complicated nature of love and loyalty. He stood beside my mother publicly, made clear through his presence and his demeanor that he supported her, that he forgave her for the affair because he understood the impossibility of the circumstances that had driven it. But other people were less forgiving. Sunday came, and with it, a shift in how I experienced my family's place in the community. We went to church, my mother insisted on it. Said that avoiding it would be worse than facing people directly. I watched as conversations halted when she entered rooms, watched as people exchanged glances, whispered behind their hands. It was high school clique dynamics played out by adults who should have known better. The priest, a man named Father Michael who'd known our family for years, caught us after the service. "I wanted you to know that the rumors I've been hearing don't change how I see you," he told my mother. "You're human. You've made mistakes. That's what we're all here to process, isn't it? To figure out how to live with the imperfection of our choices." It was kind, and my mother's eyes filled with tears at his kindness, but not everyone was as generous. There was a phone call that afternoon from someone on the school board, a man my father knew professionally, essentially saying that it might be better if my parents stepped back from certain community roles for a while. The unspoken subtext was clear: "Your scandal makes us uncomfortable, and we'd prefer if you'd remove yourselves from our sight." That evening, I sat with my parents in the living room, and for the first time, we didn't pretend. My mother talked about the shame she felt, the way she'd built her entire identity around maintaining a certain image, and how that image had been shattered in a single week. My father talked about the helplessness of watching people he'd called friends turn their backs on someone he loved, and I talked about my role in it. "I'm sorry," I said again. "If I hadn't contacted Robert, if I hadn't gone to meet him, the secret would have come out eventually," my father said. "We were planning to tell you after Christmas anyway. Patricia would have learned the truth then, or someone else would have figured it out. You didn't cause this, Sarah. You just accelerated it. That doesn't make it better," my mother said quietly. "The humiliation is still here. The judgment is still here. The loss is still here." Over the following weeks, life adjusted into a new configuration. My mother lost friendships she'd thought were permanent. My father's professional reputation took a hit. Though not severely, people seemed more willing to forgive the husband who'd been wronged than the wife who'd done the wronging. I returned to college and found myself more protective of my family's privacy, more guarded in my interactions with other students, and something shifted in how I saw my mother. The anger I'd been carrying, anger at the secrecy, at the lies, at the decisions made about me without my consent, didn't go away, but it transformed. It became something more complex, empathy mixed with disappointment, understanding mingled with residual hurt. She'd made a mistake. A significant one, with long-lasting consequences. But she was also a woman who'd loved someone she couldn't have, who tried to do the right thing in an impossible situation, who'd built a life based on a single deception and had to watch that life crumble when the deception was exposed. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my attempt to uncover the truth, I'd become complicit in my mother's public humiliation. I'd forced honesty into the open, and honesty had a cost that was much higher than I'd anticipated. That's the thing about family secrets, they don't just hurt the people who keep them. They hurt everyone around them, and sometimes the person who reveals them most of all. Christmas came anyway, as it always does, indifferent to human suffering. My parents decorated the house with the same care they always had, the same wreaths, the same lights, the same careful attention to creating warmth and tradition. But this year, everything felt like a performance, a desperate grasping at normalcy in a world that had fundamentally shifted. My brother came home with Catherine, oblivious to most of what had transpired. He knew there had been some family drama, as he called it, but he seemed determined not to engage with the details. Catherine, however, was different. I caught her watching my mother with new eyes, calculating something I couldn't quite read in her expression. It was Christmas Eve when everything came to a head, and my parents had planned to tell me the truth that night. They didn't know I already knew. didn't realize that the secret they were about to reveal had already been exposed to half the community. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, the tree glowing in the corner, the house quiet and still. My brother had gone to bed, claiming jet lag. Catherine had retired to the guest room, citing fatigue, and my father cleared his throat, a signal I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to something important. "Sarah, your mother and I need to talk to you about something," he began. "Something we should have told you years ago, but we didn't. And we're sorry for that." I watched my mother's face. She looked terrified, as if this conversation might crack her open entirely. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. "I know," I said quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed. My mother's head snapped up, her eyes searching mine. "What do you mean, you know?" my father asked carefully. "I found the birth certificate," I said. "Months ago. I found the letters, the photographs, the emails. I know that Robert Castellano is my biological father. I know that you and Mom had an affair. I know that you chose to raise me as your own, David, and I know that Mom decided to keep Robert out of my life." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "I also know that I contacted Robert on my own. I know that he told Patricia, and Patricia told half the community. I know that Mom has lost friendships because of the secret I helped expose." The air in the room felt thin, difficult to breathe. My father looked at my mother, then back at me. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since before Thanksgiving. I've had months to process this. I've met with Robert. I've spoken with him multiple times since that first meeting. And I've thought about what I want to say to you both, but I still don't have words that feel adequate." My mother stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to us. When she spoke, her voice was very small. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry for all of it. For the affair, for the deception, for making decisions about you without your input. I thought I was protecting you. I thought that by keeping Robert out of your life and letting David claim you, I was giving you the best possible chance at happiness and stability. But I was also protecting myself. I was protecting my reputation, my marriage, my image. And that was selfish." I watched her shoulders shake slightly, and I realized she was crying, not the controlled, elegant tears she allowed herself in public, but real tears, the kind that come from a place of genuine anguish. "I built my entire life on a lie," she continued, still facing the window. "And I expected you to live within that lie with me. I expected you to accept the version of events I'd constructed without ever questioning it. That wasn't fair to you." My father was watching me carefully, gauging my reaction. "I'm not angry," I said, and I realized it was true. Not anymore. I was angry. I was furious. But anger requires energy, and I've spent months processing this, and somewhere along the way, the anger transformed into something else. "Into what?" my mother asked, finally turning to face me. "Into grief," I said. "Grief for the relationship we could have had if you'd trusted me with the truth. Grief for the family dynamic we've lost. Grief for the version of you I thought you were, the woman I believed was entirely honest and entirely good. Because you're not entirely good, Mom. You're human. You're flawed. You're capable of deception and selfishness and poor judgment. And I think I needed to learn that." My mother sank back into her chair, as if the words had physically pushed her down. "What do you want from us?" my father asked quietly. "I want honesty," I said. "I want you both to stop pretending that the secret doesn't exist, that the affair didn't happen, that the consequences aren't real. I want you to stop managing my emotions and start trusting me to have emotions. I want Mom to understand that she hurt me not by having an affair, not by choosing David over Robert, but by deciding that I couldn't handle the truth." My mother's face crumpled. "I was trying to protect you." "I know," I said. "And I understand that. But protection that requires deception isn't really protection. It's control." "You're right," my father said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like relief. "You're absolutely right. We made decisions for you instead of with you, and we justified it by telling ourselves it was in your best interest. But it was really about making our lives easier." I looked at him, this man who'd raised me, who'd called me his daughter despite the absence of biological connection, and I felt a wave of complicated emotion wash over me. Love, certainly, but also disappointment, and something that might have been pity. "I need to know something," I said to my father. "When you agreed to raise me, when you agreed to pretend I was your biological child, did you ever resent me? Did you ever look at me and feel anger that I was Robert's, not yours?" He was quiet for a long time. When he answered, his voice was steady and honest in a way that told me he was finally allowing himself to speak truth. "Yes," he said. "In the beginning, I did. Not at you, but at the situation. I felt like I was living someone else's life, raising someone else's child, pretending to be someone I wasn't. And I resented your mother for putting me in that position, for asking me to shoulder that burden. But somewhere along the way, that resentment faded. You became my daughter not because of biology, but because I chose you every single day. And that choice made you mine in a way that genetics never could have." Tears were running down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. "I'm angry at you both," I said. "But I'm also grateful. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the deception, you both loved me enough to make difficult choices. Mom chose to give me a stable family. David chose to raise me as his own. Robert chose to step back and let that happen. You all made sacrifices, and even though I don't agree with all of the choices you made, I recognize the love that motivated them." My mother stood up again and crossed the room to me. She knelt in front of my chair, and for the first time in years, I saw her completely vulnerable, completely stripped of the performance that usually defined her. "I'm sorry," she said again. "I will spend the rest of my life being sorry for this, for all of it." "I know," I said. And I reached out and took her hand. "And I forgive you. Not immediately, and not completely. But I'm working toward it. Because holding on to anger is exhausting, and I'm tired." We sat like that for a long time, the three of us, my mother kneeling, my father watching, me sitting in the middle, caught between the life I'd thought I had and the life I actually did outside. Snow began to fall, soft and quiet, covering everything in white. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner. The house was warm and still. And for the first time since I'd discovered the secret, I felt like I could breathe. The confrontation I'd anticipated, the shouting, the accusations, the dramatic revelation, didn't happen. Instead, there was this, honesty, finally, after years of carefully constructed lies. Not easy, not painless, but real in a way that mattered. My mother stood up and went to get tissues. My father and I sat in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This silence contained understanding. It contained the acknowledgement that we'd all been hurt, and that we were all doing our best to survive the aftermath. "What happens now?" my father asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I'm going to continue talking to Robert. I'm going to continue being your daughter, both of you. And I'm going to try to build relationships with all three of you that are based on truth instead of performance. Whether that's possible, I don't know. But I want to try." My mother returned with tissues and sat down beside me. She didn't say anything, but she took my hand, and I let her. That Christmas Eve, my family finally became honest. Not perfect, not healed, but real. And in the end, that was enough. The months that followed Christmas were marked by a slow, tentative rebuilding. Not reconstruction that would imply returning to what had been before, and that was no longer possible. Instead, it was something new, something more fragile and more honest than what had existed before. My mother changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph developing in solution. She stopped performing quite so carefully. She allowed herself to be seen as flawed, to acknowledge her mistakes not just to me but to others. She and Patricia never fully reconciled that friendship had become too fractured, but she found new friendships with people who knew the truth about her and didn't judge her for it. She joined a support group for women navigating complex family dynamics, and she came home from those meetings changed, thoughtful, working through layers of guilt and shame with other women who understood. My father and I developed a new kind of closeness. I began asking him questions I'd never thought to ask before. What did he think when my mother first told him she was pregnant? How did he make the decision to stay with her? Did he ever regret it? His answers were always thoughtful and honest, and through those conversations, I came to understand. That love isn't always about perfect circumstances or ideal situations. Sometimes love is about choosing, again and again, to show up for someone despite the difficulty, despite the betrayal, despite the weight of carrying someone else's past. Robert and I began a slow courtship of sorts, not romantic, obviously, but a getting to know you that unfolded over months and years. We'd have lunch occasionally, then coffee more regularly. He'd call on my birthday and we'd talk for hours. I met his colleagues, attended some of his lectures, began to understand the landscape of his intellectual life. He was brilliant in ways I hadn't anticipated, and kind in ways that seemed fundamental to who he was. I discovered that I had inherited his love of stories, his tendency to look for meaning in small details, his ability to see connections between seemingly disparate things. I had my mother's intensity and my father's steadiness. I was not the child of one man or one affair or one decision, but the product of all these intersecting choices, all these complicated relationships. About 6 months after Christmas, I brought Robert to meet my parents formally. We gathered in my parents' living room on a Saturday afternoon. There was coffee and pastries, the kind of careful civility that marked important occasions. My mother was nervous. I could see it in the way her hands moved, the slight tremor in her voice. My father was calm, having apparently made peace with the situation some time ago. Robert arrived at exactly the time he'd said he would, bringing flowers for my mother, not roses, which would have been too intimate, but sunflowers, bright and impersonal and somehow appropriate. The conversation was stilted at first. We talked about the weather, about my studies, about Robert's upcoming sabbatical. But gradually, something shifted. My father asked Robert about his research, and Robert became animated, his usual gentle demeanor transforming into something passionate and alive. My mother listened, and I saw her watching him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not regret, exactly, but perhaps some acknowledgement of the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. After about an hour, my father suggested that Robert and I go for a walk while he and my mother cleaned up. It was clearly an orchestrated maneuver designed to give my parents privacy, and I was grateful for my father's thoughtfulness. Robert and I walked through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, passing houses I'd known my entire life, seeing them with new eyes. That went well, Robert said. Did it? I asked. I thought it was uncomfortable. Comfortable would have been dishonest, he replied. The discomfort acknowledged that we're all navigating something complicated. I think that was actually appropriate. We walked in silence for a while, and then he said something that I've thought about countless times since. I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even acknowledgement. I made my choices a long time ago, and I've made peace with them. But if you ever want me to be part of your life, I'm here. That's all I wanted to say. You're already part of my life, I told him. You've always been part of my life, even when I didn't know it. Now you're just a part one can actually see and interact with. He smiled at that, and we continued walking. Over the following year, I began to piece together a new identity. Not as the betrayed daughter, not as the secret child, but as someone who was the product of complicated love, messy choices, and the human capacity to both hurt and forgive. I finished college. I moved to a new city for graduate school. I started building a life that was entirely my own, separate from the narrative my family had constructed. My relationship with my mother evolved into something more mature. We still had moments of tension, moments where the old hurt would surface. But we learned to talk about those moments, to move through them rather than pretend they didn't exist. She apologized for the deception, and I apologized for the accelerated exposure of it. We came to an understanding that we'd both done the best we could with incomplete information and complex emotions. My father remained steady, a constant presence. He never needed apologies from me because he understood that I wasn't angry at him, I was angry at the situation, and he'd been caught in it along with the rest of us. He became someone I could talk to about the complexity of the situation, someone who could help me navigate my relationship with Robert without feeling threatened by it. And Robert became a mentor, a friend, eventually, something like a father, not because he'd raised me, but because he'd chosen to be present in my life despite the difficulty, despite the lack of obligation. He helped me think through career decisions. He introduced me to people in the academic world. He became someone I could call when I needed advice, someone whose opinions I valued and sought out. 2 years after that first Christmas confrontation, I was in a relationship with someone who eventually became my partner. I brought them home to meet my family, and it was strange and wonderful to introduce them to all three of my fathers, the man who raised me, the man I'd come to know, and the man who'd contributed to my existence but remained somehow separate from the traditional role of father. And my partner asked me once, "Doesn't it confuse you? Having three dads?" "Not anymore," I said. "I think family is more complex than we usually allow it to be. I have a father who raised me and loved me unconditionally. I have a biological father who stepped back to let that love happen. And I have a father figure who chose to be present despite the complications. They're all legitimate. They're all important. They've all shaped who I am." My mother recovered from the initial scandal. People's memories faded, as they always do. She was no longer the subject of whispered conversations at church. She found new ways to contribute to the community, new friendships that didn't carry the weight of decades of deception. She and Patricia never fully reconciled, but they reached a kind of détente, polite when they saw each other, but no longer close. What I learned through all of this was that secrets don't just hurt the people who keep them, they hurt everyone in their orbit. But so does the exposure of secrets. There's no clean resolution, no way to reveal truth without causing pain. All you can do is move through the pain with as much honesty and grace as you can manage. I learned that my mother was not a villain. She was a woman who'd made choices based on incomplete information and the survival instincts of her time and her circumstances. I learned that my father was not a saint, but a man who'd chosen love and commitment over biological claim, and that choice cost him in ways I'm still understanding. I learned that Robert was not a tragedy or a failure, but a man who'd loved someone he couldn't have and found a way to live with that loss. And I learned something about myself, that I was capable of holding complexity. That I could be angry and grateful at the same time. That I could forgive without forgetting. That I could build relationships based on truth even after years of deception. 3 years after that Christmas, I was having dinner with Robert, and he said something that crystallized everything I'd come to understand. "I've been thinking about identity," he said. "About what makes us who we are. For a long time, I thought it was genetics, that my genetic contribution to you was the most important thing. But I think I was wrong. You became who you are through every choice people made about you. Some of those choices were mine, but most of them weren't. You became who you are through the love people showed you, even when that love was complicated and sometimes dishonest. That's what makes you you." I thought about that long after dinner ended. I thought about how I was shaped by my mother's love and her deception, by my father's commitment and his complications, by Robert's absence and his presence, by my brother's obliviousness and his loyalty, by every person who'd ever made a choice about who I was or could be. That I stopped needing to know who my real father was, because I finally understood that all of them were real. They were all part of the story of me. And that story, with all its complications and contradictions and pain, was mine to own. I'm sitting in my apartment now, years later, and I'm thinking about the version of myself who discovered that birth certificate in the linen closet. That girl was certain of so many things. She was certain that truth was simple, that secrets were evil, that honesty was always the right choice. She was certain that her family was either good or bad, that people were either trustworthy or they weren't. That I was so wrong about almost everything. What I've come to understand is that truth is complicated. Secrets can be cruel, yes, but they can also be merciful. There are truths that harm people, truths that don't need to be revealed, truths that exist in that grey space between lying and honesty. My mother's affair, for instance, did the world need to know about it? Did I need to know about it? I thought so at the time. I was so certain that exposure would lead to healing, that truth would set us all free. What actually happened was more nuanced. Yes, the exposure of the secret led to consequences. My mother lost friendships, my father's reputation took a hit, my family's place in the community was fundamentally altered. But it also led to something unexpected. It led to honesty. It led to my family finally being forced to stop performing and start being real with each other. The cost was high, but the benefits were real. I've thought many times about what would have happened if I'd never discovered the secret. If I'd lived my entire life not knowing that David wasn't my biological father, would I have been happier? I don't think so. I think I would have carried that sense of something being wrong, something being off, without ever understanding what it was. I would have been like my mother, building a life on unstable ground, never quite sure when the foundation might give way. The thing I've learned is that we can't control what we discover. We can only control what we do with that discovery. I chose to investigate, to confront, to expose. Someone else might have chosen differently. Someone else might have found the birth certificate and put it back without telling anyone. Someone else might have made peace with not knowing. I don't regret my choices, but I understand their cost in a way I didn't before. My mother asked me once, years later, what I would have wanted her to do differently. I told her the truth. I would have wanted her to tell me earlier. Not as a secret, not as something to be ashamed of, but as a fact of my life. I would have wanted her to trust me with my own story instead of deciding what I could and couldn't handle. But I also understand why she didn't do that. She was afraid. She was protecting herself and, in her mind, protecting me. Fear makes us do things we later regret. My father, David, told me something similar. He said he wished he'd had more conversations with me about identity, about what it meant to be a daughter of choice rather than a daughter of biology. He said he wished he'd been more honest about his own struggles with the situation, instead of pretending everything was fine. But he also said that if he'd been more honest, he might have pushed me away from the family, and he couldn't bear the thought of that. So he stayed silent, and that silence became its own kind of deception. Robert never said he regretted stepping back. He said that watching me grow up from a distance, knowing I was loved and cared for, was enough. He said that the relationship he and I eventually built was better than it would have been if he'd tried to claim his parental rights. He said that choosing absence allowed him to eventually choose presence, and that choice meant more to him than any biological claim ever could have. What strikes me now is how much love exists in this story, complicated, messy, sometimes painful love, but love nonetheless. My mother loved me enough to give me a stable family. My father loved me enough to raise me as his own. Robert loved me enough to let me go. These are all different kinds of love, all legitimate, all real. I think about the version of my sister-in-law that never materialized in this story. In the original query you gave me, the one about stolen jewelry, the one about marking a necklace with invisible ink and confronting a thief at Christmas dinner. I wonder what I would have done with that story. I wonder if I would have made a different choice if my family's secret had been theft instead of infidelity, exposure instead of adoption. But that's not the story I was living. My story was more complicated than a simple confrontation about stolen goods. My story was about the stolen truth, the hidden identity, the secret that shaped everything without anyone meaning for it to do so. I want to tell you something that I've learned through all of this. Secrets are heavy. They weigh on the people who keep them, and they weigh on the people who are kept from them. My mother carried the secret of my father's identity for decades. I carried the secret of knowing, for months. Even my father, who'd known all along, carried the secret of having to maintain the appearance of biological connection. We were all exhausted by the weight of it, but here's what I also want you to know. The truth, when it finally emerged, was lighter. It was painful, yes. It was complicated and messy and it caused real harm. But it was also lighter. Because we were finally allowed to stop pretending. We were finally allowed to be honest about who we were and what we'd done and why we'd made the choices we'd made. I've built a life now that's based on this hard-won understanding. I'm honest with my partner about my past, my complications, my fears. I'm honest with Robert about my feelings, about the ways his absence hurt me even though I understand why it was necessary. I'm honest with my mother about my lingering anger, even though I've also forgiven her. I'm honest with my father about my gratitude for his commitment, even though I've also grappled with the ways his silence enabled my mother's deception. This is the kind of honesty I wish had existed in my family from the beginning, not brutal honesty that destroys everything, but courageous honesty that builds something real. I think often about what would have happened if I'd been born to different parents, in different circumstances. If my mother had had the courage to leave my father and be with Robert. If my father had refused to raise me. If Robert had fought harder for his rights. But I don't dwell on those alternate timelines for too long, because I'm grateful for the life I actually have. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Because it contains real love, real pain, real people doing their best in difficult circumstances. Years have passed since that Christmas when everything changed. My mother is grandmother now. My father is still steady, still present. Robert is retired, still teaching occasionally because he can't seem to stop. I'm building a life that honors all of them, the man who raised me, the man who stepped back, the woman who made an impossible choice. I still think about that moment when I saw the necklace around my sister-in-law's neck. Not that necklace, actually, that was a different story, one I never told you because it wasn't the story I needed to tell. But I think about that moment when something ordinary becomes a revelation, when a single glance shifts everything. That's the nature of secrets. They hide until they don't. They stay buried until something brings them to the surface. And when they do surface, everything changes. But here's what I want to leave you with, dear listener: change isn't always bad. Pain isn't always meaningless. Secrets, even the ones we think we need to keep, have a way of becoming less important than the connection that honesty eventually allows us to build. That I forgive my mother now, not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. I honor my father's choice to love me despite the complication. I appreciate Robert's presence in my life, even though it came late. And I've learned to forgive myself for the role I played in exposing the secret, because I was doing my best with the information I had. None of us are villains in this story. None of us are heroes either. We're just people, doing our best to navigate love and loyalty and the impossible challenge of deciding who deserves to know the truth about us. So I leave you with this question, the same question I've asked myself countless times: what would you have done? If you'd found the birth certificate, would you have put it back and walked away? Would you have confronted your parents immediately? Would you have investigated quietly, the way I did? Would you have kept the secret, letting your family continue to live in comfortable deception? I don't think there's a right answer. I think there's only the answer you can live with, the choice that lets you sleep at night, the version of honesty you can carry without being crushed by its weight. I chose investigation. I chose exposure. I chose truth over comfort. It cost me and my family dearly, but it also freed us. It also allowed us to eventually build something real, something honest, something that could actually survive the weight of our complicated love for each other. That's what I want for all of you, whether you're keeping secrets or searching for them. I want you to find a way to be honest that doesn't destroy you. I want you to build relationships that can survive the truth. I want you to understand that love, messy, complicated, sometimes painful love, is worth fighting for, even when the truth is hard to bear. This is Auntie Mae, signing off. And I leave you with this final thought: we're all more than our secrets. We're all more than the truths we've been told or the truths we've discovered. We're all capable of holding complexity, of forgiving without forgetting, of building something real from the broken pieces of our carefully constructed lies. That's the journey I've been on. That's the story I've shared with you. And if it's helped you understand something about yourself, about your family, about the nature of secrets and truth and love, well, then it was worth telling. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share this with you. And thank you for the reminder that we're all just doing our best, navigating the impossible terrain between honesty and protection, between truth and the merciful lie. Before you leave, I want to talk to you, directly. Not as a storyteller wrapping up a narrative, but as someone who's lived through this, who's still living through it in many ways. I know that story was heavy. I know it asked a lot of you, to sit with complicated emotions, to resist the urge to judge my mother or my father or Robert, to hold space for the reality that sometimes there are no villains, only people trying to survive impossible circumstances. But I shared it with you for a reason. If you're watching this right now, and you're carrying a secret, I want you to know something: you're not alone. There are millions of people sitting in their homes, in their cars, in quiet moments, carrying truths about their families that feel too big, too heavy, too dangerous to speak aloud. You're not the only one. And whatever you're carrying, whatever secret is weighing on your shoulders, I want you to know that it doesn't have to destroy you, but it also won't go away on its own. I've learned that secrets are like wounds. If you don't clean them, if you don't let them breathe, they get infected. They fester. They poison everything around them. But if you're brave enough to expose them, to let the light in, to let people help you carry them, they can heal. Not painlessly, and not quickly, but genuinely. So here's what I'm asking you to do. If you're keeping a secret that's hurting your family, if you're living a lie that's becoming too heavy to carry, if you're watching your relationships suffer because of something you're not saying, reach out. Talk to someone. A therapist, a trusted friend, a family member. Let someone help you carry the weight. You don't have to do this alone, And if you've discovered a secret about your family, if you've stumbled upon a truth that changes everything, be careful how you handle it. Think about the consequences not just for you, but for everyone involved. Consider whether exposure is necessary for healing, or whether some truths are better managed privately, with professional help. Now, I have to ask you something, because your voice matters to me. Would you have done what I did? If you'd found that birth certificate, if you'd discovered your parent wasn't who you thought they were, would you have investigated? Would you have confronted them? Would you have searched for your biological parent? Or would you have put the secret back and pretended you never saw it? I genuinely want to know. Because there's no right answer. There's only the answer that reflects who you are, what you value, what you can live with. Drop your answer in the comments below. Don't be shy. This is a safe space. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me about your own family secrets, if you have them. Tell me about the complicated love in your own life. Your stories matter, and I want to hear them. And please, if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family, about honesty, about the weight of secrets, hit that like button. Not because I need the views, though I won't lie, they help, but because it signals to the algorithm that real, human stories matter. That we want more content that goes deep, that doesn't shy away from complexity, that treats difficult emotions with respect. Subscribe to this channel. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories about family betrayal and redemption. Stories about the people we thought we knew revealing they're someone else entirely. Stories about the courage it takes to speak truth, and the wisdom it takes to know when to stay silent. If you want to hear those stories, if you want to be part of this community of people brave enough to face the complicated reality of family, subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode, and comment. This is the most important part. Comment with your story, your question, your perspective. Because this channel isn't about me telling you stories, it's about all of us, together, navigating the impossible complexity of being human, of being family, of learning to live with secrets and truth and the messy reality in between. I read every comment. I respond when I can. And I genuinely believe that your story, your experience, your insight, your hard-won wisdom, deserves to be heard. One more thing, if you're struggling with family issues right now, if you're caught between honesty and protection, if you're trying to figure out what to do with a secret that's threatening to destroy you, please, reach out to someone. A therapist, a counselor, a trusted person in your life. Don't carry this alone. There are resources available, people trained to help you navigate this kind of complexity. You deserve support. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. My mother once told me, after everything had settled, after we'd all begun the work of healing, that she wished she'd known that honesty could coexist with love. She'd thought that telling the truth about the affair would destroy our family. But what actually destroyed us was the lie. The lie is what created the distance, the suspicion, the fracture. Once we were honest, truly, courageously honest, we were finally able to rebuild. Not the same family we'd been before. Something different, something harder one, something more real. I hope your family, whatever that looks like, whoever it includes, can find that same kind of honesty. I hope you can find a way to speak your truth without destroying the people you love. And I hope, eventually, you can find a way to build something real from the broken pieces of whatever secrets you're carrying. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to my story. And thank you for sharing your stories in the comments below, because that's how we heal, together. This is Auntie Mae. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people you love. And remember, you're never too broken to be loved. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know your thoughts.